Narayana Samarambam Vyasa Shankara Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Om Vasudevendra Yogindram Natva Jnana Pradam Gurum Mumukshunam Hitartaya Tattva Bodha Vidiyate. In the last video, we talked about the three qualities, energies, or powers that compose Maya and enable Maya to create. Because Maya, in order to be able to create, has to have Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. Sattva being knowledge, ideas, or skill. Rajas being power, specifically the power to transform one thing into another. And Tamas is the substance, material, or matter. You have an idea for a creation, Sattva. You have a material, a building material, or a substance, Tamas. And then you have Rajas, which is energy or power to transform that material or substance into the creation that you had an idea for. So that's a summary of what we talked about in the last video. There's another point to make quickly here about Rajas and Tamas specifically in regard to creation. As I said in an earlier video, the self does not actually transform into the objects, into the creation, the way that milk undergoes an actual transformation and turns into yogurt or cheese, for instance. The transformation of the self into the creation is only apparent. The way that clay is transformed into a pot, or silver is transformed into a ring, or water it transforms into ice or water vapor. Okay, in that kind of transformation, the thing in and of itself, the silver, the clay, or the water, undergoes no fundamental change. It remains exactly as it is. Clay can look like a pot, it can look like a bowl, it can look like a plate, but it's still clay. Silver can look like a ring, it can look like a necklace, it can look like an earring, it can be a crown, it can be any of those kinds of things, but fundamentally, even though it has appeared to change, it is still nothing but silver. And it's the same with water. Water can be liquid, water can be solid like ice, water can be steam, but even though it outwardly has seemed to change into something else, it's still nothing but water. It's still nothing but hydrogen and oxygen molecules, regardless of being ice, steam, or liquid. That is the kind of transformation that the self undergoes to become the creation, to be the objects. It is only an appearance. It is a seeming transformation when the self itself, again, the self being you, undergoes no change whatsoever. It still remains non-dual, limitless, ever-present, unchanging consciousness existence. It's always that, regardless of the appearance of change. Now, we've said that Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas compose Maya and allow it to create, because you're not going to have a creation without intelligence, power, or substance. But when we're saying that this creation of the world of objects is only apparent, then it brings up some other points about Rajas and Tamas specifically that we have to enumerate. Why is that? Well, even if to make a creation you have to have knowledge, power, and substance, which is obvious. You can look around at anything in the world and see that first there had to have been an idea, there had to be substance there, and then there had to be a power to transform that substance from one thing into another. You can see that, that's plain. But we're not exactly talking about the way things work in the apparent world here, because what we're saying is that in reality, there is only the self. Reality is non-dual. If there's only the self, then how can we even see something other than the self? How can we mistake the self to be a world of objects when it really isn't? And this has been mentioned before in this series, perhaps a while back, so I'll say it again, is that the only way that we can have a creation, even an apparent one, is to have ignorance. You can only mistake something to be something it isn't. And this is the whole snake in the rope story, which is very common in Vedanta. You have a person walking, there's not very much light, it's getting dark, they look over, they think that they see a snake lying there on the ground. But when they look a little bit closer and investigate it, what they thought was a snake was actually just a rope. It was always a rope. It never became a snake. It was only mistaken to be a snake through ignorance. This is the exact same situation with the self and the creation. We mistake the self to be the creation only through ignorance. Ignorance has to be the first step in a seeming or apparent creation. Now, why is that? Because, going back to the snake in the rope, if I already know that there's a rope laying there, if I have rope knowledge, say I know, oh yeah, I left a rope sitting over there next to the well, I know that. Now, if I know that, am I going to mistake that rope to be a snake when I know it's a rope? I'm not. The only way that I'm going to be able to think that that rope is a snake is if I don't know it's a rope in the first place. That is the first step in this apparent creation of the snake, is ignorance of the rope. Ignorance of the substratum, if you will, that the snake is superimposed onto. I need to be ignorant of the rope, and then I need to project or superimpose the idea of a snake onto that rope to have the apparent creation of the snake. And that is the exact same thing that happens with the self and objects, or the self and creation, whichever way you want to look at it, because creation itself is just an object. There has to be first ignorance of that self, because if you know the self, if you know that you are the self, if you know what the self is, you cannot forget that. If you have self-knowledge, you cannot forget that knowledge and accidentally mistake yourself to be something other than what you are. And so there first has to be ignorance of the self. Ignorance of the self, and only then, when you are ignorant of the nature of the self, are you able to superimpose or project qualities, name and form attributes onto the formless, nameless, non-dual self. There has to be ignorance of the self first for there to be misapprehension of the self. Same with the rope and the snake. I can't know that it's a rope. I have to have rope ignorance. Only then can I project the idea of the snake onto the rope. Similarly, have to have self-ignorance. I have to be ignorant of what the self is, that I am the self, in order to project this idea of a world of objects onto the self. Now, how does that happen? Well, this is where Rajas and Tamas comes in. Rajas and Tamas make this concealing or ignorance possible, and then the subsequent projection. We've talked about Rajas and Tamas. Rajas is the power of change or energy. Tamas is substance or material or matter. They have other powers though. Those powers being ignorance and projection. Tamas is referred to as Avarana Shakti. Shakti is a word that means power, and Avarana means cloud. Now, why is it called cloud power? Because similar to the way that a cloud obscures the light of the sun, Tamas, or ignorance, obscures the nature of the self. Now, with the cloud actually covers the sun. But ignorance doesn't actually cover the self because the self can't be affected by ignorance. That's a point to remember here. We're not actually saying that tamas or ignorance literally covers or obscures the self. It just hides your knowledge of the self. It keeps you from knowing what the true nature of the self is. And you can't say that tamas or ignorance obscures the self because the self is consciousness existence. And consciousness and existence are self-evident. They're obvious. Consciousness and existence don't require something else to be known. Okay? Consciousness is the thing by which other objects are known. It itself doesn't need anything to be known. So we can't literally hide or obscure the self the way that a cloud obscures the sun, but there can be confusion or ignorance about what the self really is, about what the true nature of the self is. And the true nature of the self is that it's limitless, non-dual, ever-present, unchanging. That's what it is. That's what you are. Okay? This is not something other than you. Okay? This is you, the self that we're talking about. That's what your true nature is. But owing to tamas, while also being matter and substance, is also the cause of ignorance. Okay? Tamas in that form is called avidya or avarana shakti, ignorance. It's something that hides what the true nature of the self is. When that happens, when the true nature of the self is obscured through ignorance, then it's possible to project name and form and attributes onto the nameless, formless, attributeless self. Just like our rope snake, we don't know what we really are. We don't really know the true nature of the self. And because of that, it is imagined to be something other than it is. It's non-dual and unchanging. It's imagined to be a multiplicity of ever-changing objects. So we have tamas, which is ignorance or concealing, and we have rajas, which is the subsequent projection or superimposition of name and form onto the nameless, formless self, where tamas in that aspect is called avarana shakti, rajas is called vikshepa shakti, or projecting power. So we have this additional information here to remember about the gunas. Sattva, rajas, and tamas are knowledge, power, and matter. Those things are required to have a creation, but since we can't actually have a creation at all, because the self is non-dual, we have to first have this ignorance that allows the idea of the creation to be projected onto the non-dual self. So, again, the creation, as I've said before, is only apparent. There's no real creation. There's ignorance of the fact that there's only the self, and then there is the projection of the idea of the creation onto the self. That's what we're trying to get rid of here. We're trying to get rid of ignorance, the ignorant belief that objects are real, that we are an object such as the body and mind, and that fundamentally there is a actual divide between myself and what appears in me. Because in truth, there's only me. There's not me plus objects. There's only the self, and that's it. Okay? There's the appearance of objects, but no actual objects. Now, when we started this whole section on creation, I made mention of the fact that in this last section of the text. We're really getting into the last part here, the conclusion. It's trying to answer the question of, well, how can there be a self and a not self? Because the text says that the self is non-dual. Right? So how are we going to heal that split, so to speak? How are we going to reconcile these two things to come to the knowledge of non-duality? It was necessary initially to divide reality into two parts, self and not self, in order to be able to see that the objects themselves were not real, and in order to be able to see that you are not an object. It does not follow any logical reason for you to be an object. You have to see that first. So that's why we use the whole self, not self teaching. But if we leave it at that, we get rid of the belief in the reality of objects, we break the identification, but then there's still you and objects. So in the final step, we got to get rid of that division. We have to heal that division so the knowledge is complete. The knowledge that reality is only you, the non-dual self. So in order to do that, the text takes up this whole topic of creation. Okay, it's going to divide the not self into a couple of different categories again. In your experience, there's you personally, meaning the mind and body. There's the greater world that you find yourself in. And then through implication, there is the creator of that world. And you look around, it seems to make sense that there's probably a creator for this world because number one, you didn't personally create it, so there must be something else. And number two, you can see that there is order and intelligence in the creation, and so we can kind of imply that, through inference, that there is a creator of this creation. So that basically divides the not self, or your general experience, into those three categories: individual person, the world the individual person finds themselves in, and then the creator of that world. And so we want to keep this in mind as we move on. What's going to happen here is that slowly we're going to collapse these parts of the not self into one another, show that they're actually non-separate, and then show that those parts of the not self, which are non-separate from one another, are actually non-separate and ultimately non-different from you, the self, thus facilitating knowledge of non-duality. So in the last part of the talk, we spoke about Maya, which is made of the gunas. So Maya is the total unmanifest cause of the entire creation. So the question might come up, hey, if Maya, which is composed of these three gunas, is unmanifest, you can't see it, you can't taste it, you can't touch it, you can't experience Maya directly, well, how does it become these objects that you can see, can taste, can touch, can experience? How does the unmanifest or the subtle become the manifest, physical, or gross? How does that happen? I will say up front that how that happens does not really matter. Okay, the point of this part of the text is not to prove exactly how unmanifest Maya, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas becomes matter, becomes the physical world. That is not the point. It's just a theory. There is a very interesting theory that the text presents about how the unmanifest Maya becomes the manifest objects. It's cool, it's interesting, but the point of the text is not to prove that that's exactly how Maya becomes objects. The whole point of this part of the text is to show how the individual person, the individual mind and body, is non-different and totally non-separate from the world around it. That is the main point here. And because of that, I'm not really going to go into the theory in depth, because it can be a little bit of a distraction. You can kind of get sidetracked a little bit. If anybody's really interested in learning more about this theory, then I recommend that you get a copy of Swami Dayananda's commentary on Tattva Bodha that is published by Arsha Vidya. He goes into this theory of how the unmanifest becomes the manifest in detail. He goes into it exhaustively, so I'll just leave it to him to take care of that, and we're going to go ahead and move forward with the text, just briefly touching on this theory. Now, what is this theory called? In Sanskrit, it's called Panchikarna. It is the theory about how the 5 elements, air, fire, earth, water, and space, in other words, matter, comes into manifestation. So, in a nutshell, the idea is that from Maya, which is unmanifest, comes this idea of the 5 elements. As we said, any creation first starts with knowledge. It starts with an idea. So how can I have air, fire, earth, water, and space if there's not knowledge or the idea for air, fire, earth, water, and space first? And that is what the Panchikarna theory is saying. It's saying, okay, the first manifestation, if you will, is a idea. And we have the idea for the 5 elements. And these are called tanmatras, which is not important to remember. It's just the idea of the 5 elements. Now, we have this subtle form or this subtle idea of the 5 elements. Then they divide. Each element splits in half. One half of that element remains the same. The other half splits into 4 more parts. These 4 parts combine with a portion of a fourth of each element and then recombines. Okay, so you have an element that has a half and then also an eighth of itself, along with 3/8 of another element. And I'll apologize if my math is incorrect on that. Fractions and things aren't exactly my strong suit. Vedanta, I'm pretty decent at. Math, not so much. So anyway, the point is that the elements divide, recombine, and then they become the gross elements, the Mahabhutas, the great elements. Okay, these are the physical manifest elements that you can see, taste, touch, hear, and smell. Now again, is that really important? Not really, if what we are trying to do is get to the knowledge of what our true nature is, of who we really are. And our concern here is to how to get from the division of self and not self to just self, okay, to get from duality to non-duality. So what's the main point here? Is the main point that there's this really cool way that the subtle elements combine, and then divide, then recombine and become the gross elements? No, that's not the point. The point is that in the same way that the physical elements are just matter, okay, the subtle elements are also just matter. Okay, the cause and the effect here are going to have the same status. They're going to have the same nature. Okay, Maya, Mithya, objects, whether it's unmanifest or manifest, is just matter. Okay, you can look at it as 2 sides of the same coin. The analogy that I always like to use is matter and energy. Okay, you can see something, a manifest object, and you would call that matter. Like you see a rock and you say that rock is made out of matter. Well, that's true, but if you look at the flip side of it, that matter is really just energy when you break it down. Okay? So we have the unmanifest aspect of matter, which you could call energy, and then the manifest aspect, which is matter. They're really just the same thing in different forms. And that's the exact same way here when we have Maya, which is unmanifest and can't be experienced directly, and you have manifest objects. They both have the exact same status. They both have the same nature. They are just mithya. They are just objects. They are just matter. Okay, so Maya is matter, unconscious, inert matter. And what it creates, the manifest world, is also unconscious, manifest matter. Okay, we have the subtle aspect of matter, as we talked about. This subtle aspect of matter makes up the subtle body. Okay, so your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions, your physiological functions, the pranas, the mind, the intellect, ego. Okay, if you remember back to when we talked about the parts of the subtle body, that whole subtle body, which is not a manifest object, is composed of the subtle aspect of matter, of the 5 elements. Okay, 5 elements and matter are synonymous. So we have Maya first becoming the subtle elements, and those subtle elements make up the subtle body, composing the constituents of your mind. And then those subtle elements divide and recombine and become the physical elements, and they make up the body and the world around the body. So the point being that Maya and everything downline from Maya, everything that is created by Maya, all effects of Maya, from the subtle to the subtle body, the mind, to the physical body and the world, are all just matter. That's it. So what then is the implication of that fact, that Maya, that the mind, the body, and world are all matter? Well, the implication is that they are essentially non-different from one another, non-separate from one another. Why does that matter? Well, we're trying to show how everything is essentially one, how reality is non-dual. But the appearance of things tells us otherwise. It looks like my mind and my body are different from one another. They may not be separate from one another, because I can't really find a division between the body and the mind, but they're not different from each other. Why is that? Because they're both composed of matter. The name and the form might be different. A thought may be different than a hand, for instance. Feeling happy might be different than your nose, for instance. It seems that way, but in reality, what? The mind and also the body are nothing but matter. Okay, the same way that a clay figurine and a clay pot are non-different as clay, the mind and the body are non-different as matter. Okay, so there's no division, there's no separation, there's essentially no difference. There's an appearance of difference, but there's no actual difference, because they are just matter. Okay, a block of ice and a cup of water might look different from the outside, but they are absolutely non-different as water. So mind, body, same. Essentially the same, because they're both matter. Now, what about this body and other bodies, or this body and the world that it finds itself in? Normally it seems like the body ends here and then the world begins. The body ends at the tip of your nose, or the tips of your fingers, or like the outside of your skin, and then anything outside of that is the world around you. But what's the body made of? Matter. Only matter. The 5 elements, if you want to look at it that way, Or you can look at it as protons, neutrons, and electrons, atoms, molecules, however you want to think of it. It's just matter. Now, is the matter that your body made out of different than the matter that someone else's body is made out of? No. They might look different. You might be tall and fair-skinned. They might be dark-skinned and short. But the matter that you are both made of, speaking of the body, is completely the same. Now, what about the space outside of the body? Is anything outside of the body not matter in your everyday experience? No, everything's matter there too. The chair you're sitting on, the clothes you're wearing, the food you're eating, the air you're breathing, all of that kind of stuff is also matter. So the point then is that from that perspective, where there appears to be a difference between the individual person and the world, remember, we're talking about these three factors here. We're saying there's the individual person, there is the world that this person finds itself in, and then there is the creator of that world. So right now we're looking at the individual person and the world that it finds itself in, and we're seeing that although there appears to be a separation, there appears to be a real difference between those two things, there really is not. There's not a person and the world. There is only matter. So you and the world that you find yourself in are non-different as matter. It's really the same thing. You have two glasses of water. They might look different, but there is absolutely no difference from one water to the next water. Water is water, no matter what, and no matter what appearance it may take on, it's still just hydrogen and oxygen and nothing else. So in the same way, no matter what form matter may take, whether it be your mind, your body, or the world around you, all of that is still matter. So there is an identity, there is a non-separation, there is a non-difference of the individual person and the total world as matter. So this is step one. Okay? We have just seen the non-difference between those two factors, the individual and the total world. And we still have to talk about the creator of that world, and that will be the topic of the next video. You can come back and we're going to talk about Ishvara. Purnamidaf, Purnamidam, Purnat, Purnamadachyate, Purnasya, Purnamadaya, Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.
Bhaja Govindam, Bhaja Govindam.